Hello, my name's Phil Smart and I'm the Assistant Policy Manager with the Rail Freight Group. A very warm welcome to this webinar, which is being held in association with Binary Carbon as part of Decarbonising Transport Week. When Binary Carbon approached us to talk about the rail freight industry, it was undoubtedly with good reason. Rail is, by some margin, the most environmentally benign choice of transportation for heavy loads over long distances. By taking a unit load off our roads and putting it on rail, we reduce its carbon footprint by 76%. And that's with the existing traction mix. The carbon footprint decreases still further when we electrify the railway, and it all but vanishes when we power the national grid with a mix of renewables and nuclear energy. Electrification also allows loads to be moved without incurring a volume or weight penalty that we might expect with batteries or hydrogen, which will be a huge challenge for the economics of long-distance road haulage once we phase out the use of diesel engines. Electrification, however, requires investment from the public purse, which is under a lot of pressure at the moment, and future schemes based around key freight routes are still some way off. But that debate continues, and the Rail Freight Group are very much part of it. It will be easy for the rail freight industry to rely on its low-carbon reputation and present a webinar that develops this case in more detail. But today we thought we would present something a little different and look at the role that rail freight might play in a circular economy. This is a fresh economic philosophy based on reducing the environmental impact of economic activity and moves us away from the traditional model of extracting resources from a finite earth, turning them into products for human consumption, and then leaving behind a trail of waste, much of it toxic. In future, we will need to pay much more attention to the reuse, recovery, and renewal of the items we buy. To develop this idea, I'm joined by three experts. Carl Waring from the Fraser-Nash Consultancy and is also a lecturer at the University of Derby, Susanna Rockett of GB Rail Freight, and Victoria Crabtree from Suez Recycling and Recovery Limited. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A as they occur to you, and we will try to get in as many as possible. So let's start with Carl. Carl is a principal consultant at Fraser-Nash Consultancy, specialising in the operation of complex businesses that manage asset infrastructure. He advises on corporate strategy for new products and services and advises government regulators on how to monitor and report on asset management. He is an advisor on complex multi-stakeholder settings in the rail, power and defence sectors. He's a Derby University lecturer and PhD researcher in applied systems theory and the circular economy. He's currently leading the production of the Circular Economy Network for Transportation Systems white paper on rail as the circular economy enabler, due for publication at an international conference in May this year. So over to you, Carl, who seems to have disappeared, which is unfortunate. He's having a bit of connection problems. Hopefully he'll be back with us. So what we might do then in that case, if we have one of our other presenters ready to go, perhaps Victoria, if you don't mind stepping in. So Victoria Crabtree is Regional Manager with Suez Recycling and Recovery Limited. Suez are one of the key players in the UK for managing the waste stream, from recovery and transportation of waste materials to reprocessing for their reuse. They're proud to be users of the rail network, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the opportunities and challenges of their work in this field. So over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Phil. I'll just share my screen. Am I on there? Yeah, brilliant. So, all right, so thank you, Phil, for inviting me along today. My credentials are nowhere near as impressive as Carl's, but hopefully you'll get a taste from me about how we operate the waste on the ground and make waste by rail as part of the circular economy. So as Phil said, my name is Victoria Crabtree. I'm the Regional Manager for the Northwest for Suez Recycling and Recovery. So I manage 11 waste facilities for Suez, ranging from Kendal in Cumbria down to Merseyside, excluding the Greater Manchester area. So in terms of Suez as a business, We have over 350 operational sites in the UK, and we manage over 12 million tonnes of waste for our 75 local authority customers and 25,000 industrial and commercial customers. And we do this with the help of our 5,700 employees across a range of different facilities. So we have reuse facilities, materials recycling facilities, predominantly transfer stations and household waste recycling centres. We do have some specialist facilities such as reuse shops, energy from waste facilities, anaerobic digestion plant, and composting facilities, just to name a few of the services that we offer. So we've been had a strong focus on the circular economy for many years. It's what we do, you know, it's what our business is based around. And you can see from the facilities that we have in the UK, we have the tools and resources to help our customers to move waste up the waste hierarchy. So first and foremost, you know, we're proud to say that even though we're a waste management company, we want less waste in the UK. So, you know, it is our business, but we want less of it. So that means prevention is the top of the tree for us, and we help our customers in waste prevention. Then we move on to waste as preparing for reuse to stop the waste getting into the system in the first place. And I'll talk to you a little bit about our flagship facility in Manchester in a moment. Again, from the recycling point of view, from municipal collections through to the recycling facilities, the MRFs that we operate in the UK, extracting valuable materials from the waste stream and helping prevent any disposal options for material that we can extract. Then we have our energy from waste plants, so residual waste that can't be recycled. We try and avoid landfill where possible. Unfortunately, you know, there are many local authorities that still rely on disposal opportunities and options rather than recovery, just because of the lack of recovery options locally, which again is where rail transport really comes into its own in terms of being able to move waste to facilities where we can recover it rather than put it to landfill. So again, we do have landfill options as the last point in the waste hierarchy. So just as an example of how we help our customers with the waste hierarchy, at Manchester we have our flagship Renew Centre. If you've not had a chance to see it, if you've got a focus on reuse, then it's a brilliant place to visit. A really good shining example of how reuse can be so effective. In the first year of operation, they managed to extract 50,000 items for reuse and saved over 500 tonnes going to either disposal or recovery. So a great site, a great opportunity for social value as well as preventing waste. So that's just one example of our waste movements in the UK. So I've always been fascinated by how we can move waste by rail. My background prior to joining the waste industry in 2015 was around moving products by road. So in the haulage industry and the construction industry, I came into the waste industry in 2015 and predominantly moved waste around the UK by road, collections, etc. So the thought of actually being able to be involved in rail transport of waste was really exciting. So last year I got the opportunity to take on the Knowsley Rail Transfer and Loading Station as part of my area, and it's been an interesting journey and one that continues and will continue to be interesting, just in light of what's happening in the industry and the changes that are coming. So this is Knowsley Rail Transfer Station, and I'll just talk you a little bit through the journey of the waste as it comes through us and things that are going on that will undoubtedly change in the future. So each day, 1,700 tonnes of waste comes into Knowsley Rail Transfer Station, and we have 2 large reception pits. So the vehicles tip into the pits and the waste is then moved through the system. So to give you an idea of what 1,700 tonnes looks like, that just looks like a pit. It's very hard to visualize how much waste is actually in there. So for those of you that are not familiar, 1,700 tonnes is roughly the equivalent of 170 fully loaded refuse collection vehicles. So the types of vehicles that pass by everybody's house weekly, fortnightly, monthly, whatever your collection schedules are. So that comes into Knowsley every day, and we're responsible for then moving that waste up to our recovery facility at Wilton. So the way we do that, the reception pits are there, and you can see the overhead crane. The crane moves along, picks up the waste and puts that through the compactors at the transfer station. You can see to the right here, the compactor doors being closed of the container doors being closed, ready for loading onto the train. So once those containers are all compacted and filled, ready to go, we have container handling units on site. The train pulls into the transfer station. The waste gets loaded in by the container into the train from the container handling units. The train shunts along and gets ready to go on its journey. So each train has 66 containers, around about 900 tons per train, and we have 2 trains per day, and the waste goes on its journey up to Wilton, ready to be processed at the other end. So when it arrives at the other end, it's loaded off by overhead crane onto tilters, and it's tipped into the waste pit at Wilton, ready to be burnt. Moving waste by rail for us saves around 21,000 HGV journeys to the energy from waste plant and offsets approximately 127,000 tonnes of carbon each year. So, you know, a fantastic way of moving the waste. So in 2020, we reached a milestone of 100,000 containers filled, but we were not satisfied with just the status quo. So the guys on the ground, with a very much lean focus and continuous improvement focus, looked at ways on how we can improve the facility and how we can improve what we do with the waste. So they got to thinking about how we could improve the amount of waste being sent by train on the same train. So previously, the compactors worked on a pressure basis. So the pressure would get to a certain limit and the containers would stop being filled. So they looked at how we could change from pressure filling the containers to filling by weight. And that way we could control better how much weight goes in the containers to prevent any overweight containers, because that would mean reprocessing if they were too heavy for the train. But it also meant that we could have a minimum fill level for each container, and we'd get a notification when that was reached. So by filling by weight, we were able to increase the number of tonnes sent by train on the same 2 trains by 150 tonnes per day, saving 36 trains per year and offsetting an estimated 7,500 tonnes of CO2 saving every year. And we implemented that in 2021, and it had an immediate impact. So, you know, really good idea from the guys on the ground seeking to make improvements. And again, it's in line with our continuous improvement ethos, and we won't stop there. So we were pleased that in 2020, that was recognised as an Innovation of the Year for the Awards for Excellence, and the guys went and got their well-earned award. So if we talk about the journey so far, the sector itself since 1990s reduced its emissions by 46%, and you can see that the move to, you know, moving waste by rail as well as the other innovations in the industry are helping to reduce that, and you know, we want to contribute to moving that further down the chart. So future opportunities, we've already got the ability to weigh containers and move where, you know, change how much is actually filled in each container. Our future opportunities are to look at how the waste comes off at the other end, and if we can improve the crane abilities at the other end, we could potentially fill the containers further to meet the capacity of the trains and cranes at the other end. So we're looking at other opportunities to reduce that further and increase the amount that can go on per train. So I think Phil touched on the electrification of the trains. So the Rail Environment Policy Statement from the Department of Transport does highlight that most freight rail is carried by diesel trains, and it, as Phil said, it's still about a quarter of the CO2 emissions of HGVs per tonne mile travelled, and a good way of moving goods on land, are one of the lowest carbon ways. And you know, it is recognised that actually decarbonising rail freight train is a challenge, because obviously it needs higher tonne total outputs compared to passenger trains, but electrification of the network, you know, will undoubtedly improve carbon reduction. But changes are coming. So when we look at the circular economy and the consultations being done by the government and the changes that are coming to the extended producer responsibility scheme, consistent collections, deposit return scheme, much of the waste that currently goes by train to Wilton will be extracted as part of these schemes. So when we think about plastics, food waste, etc., there will be less going on the train, which again can reduce the amount of trains needed to be sent. So just one example of that. We've just got planning permission at our Darwin site, where I am here today, sunny Darwin, to build an anaerobic digestion plant. So with the mandatory food waste collections that are coming in the future years, we can estimate that the waste that we move currently from Knowsley will be reduced by around 40,000 tonnes, which is a conservative estimate of the amount of food waste that we will reduce by doing mandatory food waste collections. Potentially, that could reduce trains by 0.85 trains per week. Help us then to turn waste into valuable renewable resources at the plant, producing biogas to produce renewable energy, and also have a byproduct of nutrient-rich organic fertiliser which can be used locally too, and potentially in a full circular economy produce vehicle fuel to fuel the vehicles that are delivering into site. So, really exciting times coming with the changes. And I think rail plays a huge part in that, and it'd be really good to see more waste being able to be moved by rail to cut down the carbon impact of moving waste around the country, because as much as waste will reduce, it's not going to go away, and we really need to be focused on how we can improve that as a country. So with the changes that are coming comes opportunity. So there's an estimated 450,000 jobs that could be created in the sector by 2035. And I think I heard an interesting fact recently about jobs that previously didn't exist. And it's interesting to think that the young people coming through now, they're going to be working in jobs that don't currently exist because of the changes and the opportunities that the circular economy brings. So thank you for listening.
Great, thanks, Victoria. As someone who, in another life, parallel to this one, is the portfolio holder for waste on a local authority, it's very interesting to see, as an authority, a local, just to put your numbers in some context, that a local authority like ours burns about 4,000 tonnes of carbon, and you're saving 127,000. So it really is impressive. I think we're just re-establishing a link with Carl Waring, who looks like he's managed to come in on another line. So hopefully we can move to Carl now. But we do have a question on waste to come back to. So as I mentioned earlier, Carl is a principal consultant at the Fraser Nash Consultancy, specialising in the operation of complex businesses. He's also a university lecturer at Derby University, and is currently working on a white paper on rail as a circular economy enabler. So, with fingers crossed, over to you now, Carl.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah, fine.
If you could just put that into presentation mode, Yvonne, that'd be good.
Hang on, I've just got to share my screen.
Or yeah, okay, that's fine.
Hang on. Okay, you're right with that?
I would be if I could probably see things. So I'll have to do it relatively blind. So the first slide. As Phil mentioned, I'm involved in producing a white paper. So this is on the back of the Institute of Asset Management white paper, which is basically asset management as an enabler for the circular economy. And this particular white paper for the rail sector is sponsored by the PSLC research and part of the circular economy network of transportation systems. Could I go to the slide 2, please? I'm not actually be able to see your screen for some reason. So on slide 2, it just shows the breakdown of the relationship between the Institute of Asset Management and the reason why we're producing this white paper. So it's a research white paper, and eventually we'll hopefully get an industry response to the academic white paper, as it were. So if we go to slide 3, please. So,
It's the one that start the thinking from the right place.
No, what the circular economy is. So
just back one.
Yeah, I can't. I'm sorry, it's not moving. Do you want to try sharing your screen if you've got a better, Carl? Because especially if you can't see it, it's not very useful, is it?
Yeah. Let me just see if I can do this.
If you can't see the slides, could other people see the slides?
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, that's looking good.
Okay.
We just want presenter mode.
Fingers crossed. Just for some reason. Right, if you can see my screen now, I'll just put this in presenter mode now. Here we are. So the circular economy, there's a lot of stuff around the circular economy. People have been doing lots of circular economy activity, and we talked about waste. And managing waste is important as it's essentially the lowest form of value, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But in general, the circular economy is anything that grows the economy, but it also has to incentivize regenerative and restorative outcomes. And you have to reflect back on, for some reason, something's got control of my computer. No idea what's happening here. Right, and you have to compare what the circular economy is in relation to our current economy. And you could argue that our current economy has been driven by profit alone to the detriment of everything else. So this is essentially where the circular economy is starting from, if you like. Our current economy sort of looks at increasing consumption of single points of sale, if you like, and doesn't really particularly consider the dilapidation of resources. And also, if you look at how businesses work and interact, it's very important to have a viable business economy, that we have a diverse business foundation of different types of businesses doing different things in different regions to support our societies at a local, regional and national level. So when we start talking about the circular economy, we're also talking about the deployment of systems theory and systems thinking, which sort of looks at the value of the interconnected parts, and ultimately the value of that being greater than the value of the sum of the individual parts. So it's not just about individual companies making profits, it's about how those companies can contribute to the wider shared values. So starting the thinking from the right place, you can't be circular economy compliant, but you can be more circular economy effective than your competitor. So this is taking a step back and looking at exactly what the organisation does. Are there any opportunities to change business models? And I'll come on to that in a minute. And also, there are lots of different ways that you can start adding and creating circular economy value. And I'll talk about this. And the Institute of Asset Management white paper talks about this in a bit more detail in terms of starting here and now, which is making best use of the things that we've already got. So when we refer back to reducing consumption, why don't we just look at making things last longer, for instance? And I know that we talk about recycling, it's fundamentally important. Recycling is a transition thing. In theory, well, it's you shouldn't really be looking at recycling, you should be making things last forever. And ultimately, there are scientific constraints with making things last forever, but essentially that's the challenge. So when we're starting to think about values around the circular economy, these things are important. Recycling is very important, but in actual fact, it's the lowest form of asset value. Again, this is from an asset management perspective. The asset has served its life, and now you don't really know what to do with it. Well, why don't you start thinking about extending its life or putting it back into service after it's been refurbished? And materials, which essentially are the lowest common value denominator, but you should be looking at alternative types of materials, which basically makes the asset last longer. And carbon is a transition. It's basically a pathway, and it's a useful pathway in terms of obviously wanting to reduce carbon, and this is about decarbonising Transport Week, but it is all but a pathway. And the thing is, if you made things last forever, it would significantly reduce the carbon impact. And again, if you look at the previous slides, this idea of single volume or single point of sale in terms of how businesses generate profits and what have you. So organisations will have to change, and I just obviously, because it's a lead on from the Institute of Asset Management paper. So my computer's doing things on its own. I have no idea why, so I do apologise. So I've got no control of this computer. So if we look at how we consider things in terms of single points of sale, we also think of things at whole life cost. Sorry, just bear with me. It's a complete disaster in terms of what it's supposed to be looking at. Right. So when we look at single points of sale and single asset life cycle, this is essentially how the current operating model works in terms of take, make, waste, in terms of managing asset life cycles. We consider things in terms of whole life cost. What is the whole life cost of the assets? And this is in general how we tend to think about things. But when we look at a circular economy perspective, there are a broad range of interventions where you'd like to or create opportunities around the asset life cycle. So we can design assets reuse, we can design out excess waste, we can design in maintainability, we can reconsider how the asset is made, we can redesign how the asset is made, and also if you think about the career opportunities and the business opportunities from types of business, remanufacturing centres, refurbishing centres, all those types of things can come on stream as part of the circular economy. And that's what we mean when we're talking about regenerative activities. So these are regenerative things within the context of added value to our society. And just as an example, we ran some workshops, and Bill was kind enough to attend with some of the sector representatives, and we talked about considering products as a service operating model, which in terms of manufacturers, looking at multiple asset life cycles as opposed to just one. And here in the bottom part of the screen, we've got the opportunity to reduce life cycle costs, and so these are reduced life cycle costs if you basically make your asset have full life cycles. So it significantly reduces waste, significantly reduces added value. And this here on the left are the different types of things that the organisation would have to think of in terms of, instead of generating profit on a single point of sale, you're more actually interested in getting the asset back so it can actually be refurbished and be put back into service. And the railway is actually very good at this type of thing. They make assets last a very, very long time at all. I saw a tweet the other day where I believe someone was confused about getting onto the Chiltern line with a Mark III that had been refurbished. I don't know, coaches get refurbished every 5 years or so, but the Mark III coaches are in excess of 50 years old. So in terms of transport mode, you have to think, well, what other transport mode has assets running around its infrastructure which are 50 years old and still doing a good job? And I would argue that the rail sector doesn't promote how long it can make its assets last. And I think this is an opportunity missed. So when we're looking at systems theory and systems thinking, there are lots of opportunities where we can add circular economy value. And this is looking at the here and now, which is what are we going to do what's the best thing that we're going to do with what we've got before and after, and considering we're moving towards a future circular economy. What are the things that you would like to do with those assets that you're going to be putting into service in the future So these things about redesigning things, changing business operating models, or preparing to change business operating models. And one of the things that you can do after the asset has served its first life cycle, for example. And then overarching practices, which looks at creating strategic networks, for example, and added value, or whole life value, as we'd like to call it, which is saying, well, what exactly is the impact of this asset on the wider spectrum? What transport modes are freight potentially offsetting? And one of the things that came out of the workshop was the value of freight, rail freight, is specifically driven around profit, which isn't how it should be. And this is obviously one of the reasons why freight is predominantly linked to moving forward when it shouldn't be. So there are a lot of opportunities there to change the thinking in terms of how the value of rail freight can be expanded. And as part of the workshop, what we did was to create a whole systems view, because we determined that there wasn't a whole systems view for exploiting value from rail systems. And this is just a simple model of the different actors and stakeholders that play roles within the rail sector. And what this is doing, it's looking at the balancing between the different types of transport modes and the added value that rail provides back to those externalities, which is society, the positive impacts on health from the reduction, for instance, of pollution from alternative transport modes, the growth in business because it's expanding regeneration centres of remanufacturing capability, and all of that would open up new opportunities for innovation, for new types of materials, new types of designs, and that type of thing. And we determined that the justification for rail investment needs to be improved, particularly associated with things around the Green Book, and the whole life value needs to be taken on board. So the impact of the railway can actually be counted, which we believe is not counted properly. So just looking at the findings that came out of it's going to be coming out of the white paper. Basically 7 main findings, but we think that government should establish a rolling short, medium, and longer term level playing field to move towards a circular economy in transport systems. And it should specifically exploit the latency of railway systems to offset the negative impact of alternative transport modes. This is a massive opportunity that's being missed at the moment, and this needs to change. And one of the ways of changing that is to consider whole life value at a local, regional and national level in terms of what the railway does. It's essentially the land transport backbone, and that needs to be exploited significantly. We think we should simplify and modularize the technical landscape of the railway infrastructure. It's far too complicated as we think it is at the moment, and I think there are a large number of opportunities where it could be simplified. The focus should also be on railway asset lifecycle performance, and this is very important because the performance of assets at the moment are predominantly orientated around compliance in terms of meeting specific standards, and obviously everything should meet standards, but we think the competition should be set at where suppliers should be exceeding standards or exceeding compliance by, and not maintaining minimum thresholds of compliance, because that creates the wrong type of behaviour, and also it locks in certain types of technologies, which is something that we don't think is necessary. There should be a big move towards asset as a service, so manufacturers take their assets back. They shouldn't offload the responsibility back to the purchasers to get rid of the assets. And in supporting this sort of way of working, there needs to be a number of common platforms developed, and those are like physical platforms or specific ways of doing things, or standards which are obviously the railway has a great opportunity to leverage that. But again, we still think it's the current state is far too complex. But it would be good if the supply chain could just respond to a number of standards which are generally accepted across the railway. And also, very importantly, there should be some form of open source data and communications platform, which we know Network Rail are looking at the moment, in terms of saying, wouldn't it be a good idea if you could just access data around the performance of asset infrastructure, and that's across the supply chain, or indeed anyone who can see an opportunity to take advantage of a data-centric intelligence approach. So, well, actually, we can use this data to go and do something else with, and it's very difficult to do that at the moment. And this would lead to a broader capability, which would look at railway industry resilience at a local, regional, and national level. And this is more to do with, well, when are we not going to have a railway? We're never not going to have a railway, and we want to improve the railway all the time. And that impact needs to be understood at a local, regional, and national level. And these types of measures need to be put in place, and they're context specific. Another factor that came up was the simplification of the route to engagement for railway exploitation. And this we felt was extremely difficult and extremely arduous. So if somebody developed a service where they wanted to exploit the railway, it's extremely difficult to engage. Who do you talk to? And we understand route managers, for instance, in Network Rail, obviously can contribute to how this can be done, but it's very difficult for the supply chain to access the exploitation of the railway. And also, fundamentally, we need to create this convenience of end-to-end journeys with multimodal solutions, so people can see how easy it is to use rail freight. And this is obviously in conjunction with all of these other factors that we've already discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Hopefully that sparked some ideas in people's minds for any questions. The two big messages I think I took out of that was that as a nation, we don't recognise the value of rail investment enough, and that there needs to be an improvement in the methods by which we justify in terms of changing the rules in the Green Book and so forth. And that's something that Rail Freight Group are very much in sympathy with. But the other message I took out of that was that rail needs to promote its ability to extend asset life. And I think that's a very good point to bring in Susanna Rockett. She's head of sustainability at GB Rail Freight, and she's going to describe GB Rail Freight's plans to embed circular economy principles in their supply chain, including how their projects to re-engineer locomotives that first saw life in the 1970s. So over to you, Susanna.
Thanks, Phil, and good morning, everybody. Share my screen. Can you let me know if you can see that? Good, grand, okay. Thanks very much, Phil, and thanks to Phil and Maggie for inviting me to speak this morning. Really quite excited to talk about the circular economy. I realise it's Decarbonising Transport Week, but I think it's for reasons that Carl and Victoria have touched on, and that I will kind of build on. I think it's really important for us to talk about the kind of challenges of the climate crisis beyond decarbonisation as well, and circular economy is a really good way of doing that. So there we go, right. A quick introduction to a few things, and I wanted to introduce myself, obviously, and a little bit about the rail freight industry. I realise that a lot of people on this call are members of the RFG, but I noted a few that aren't, who it's probably worth kind of introducing a little bit of who we are and what we do. Similarly, a little bit about GB Rail Freight, who we are and what we do, and where we would fit kind of from a sustainability perspective. So from my perspective, I'm head of sustainability at GB Rail Freight. My background is in kind of rail operations. I've been in the rail industry for about 12 years. I am very much an operator, not an engineering background. So if anybody has any complicated questions about how we re-engineered our trains, I am the wrong person to ask. But I have spent the past sort of 4 or 5 years in GB Rail Freight implementing new services, so bringing together all the different elements we need to run new services for our customers, and moved into sustainability formally about 6 months ago into this role, but I've spent the past kind of 18 months, 2 years learning a lot, and coming across a lot of people who are also learning a lot. I think in the field of sustainability, we are all very much kind of learning as we go. So from a rail freight industry perspective, I always kind of think that the logistics industry is kind of the secret industry of the UK, and rail even more so than road, not least because you don't tend to get stuck behind freight trains in the same way that you do with lorries, particularly if you spend as much time on the A1 as I do. But in terms of rail freight and its benefits to the economy and to decarbonising the economy, these figures are from the ORR. Rail freight moves between about 16 to 17 billion tonne kilometres every year. That's an awful lot of stuff. And that takes about 6 million lorry journeys off the road, which is a positive impact both in terms of carbon emissions, because rail freight is much more efficient, even though we have diesel engines, much more efficient than HGVs, and also reduces congestion, which obviously has both the negative impact societally and in terms of the environment. So in terms of GB Rail Freight, who we are an ever-growing, it seems, rail freight operator. We run about 2,000 trains a week with just over 150 locomotives and thousands of wagons, which I'm not going to put a figure on because every time I go past our depot in Peterborough, we seem to have bought some more. We're certainly a growing industry and a growing company. We've more than doubled in size since I joined about 5.5 years ago, both in terms of people and the amount of trains we run. And things that we move aggregates into construction sites, which is why I've kind of got the HS2 decorated locomotive there, but also dirt out of those construction sites to make way for the building. We've just started moving tunnel segments for HS2 actually, which is one of the a quite fun train to see. We move thousands and thousands of containers from the deep sea ports like Felixstowe, Southampton, Liverpool, Tees, around the country, carrying consumer goods, carrying manufacturing parts, carrying all sorts of things that actually we very rarely even know what they are. We move cars, we move people, known as self-loading freight in our terminology, because we run the service, the Caledonian Sleeper service between London and Scotland every night. And we also move things that maintain the railway. So we run a lot of services for Network Rail, moving ballast, sleepers, and so forth around to maintain our existing railway. And we do a lot of testing of passenger rolling stock. So all new passenger rolling stock coming in needs thousands of miles of fault-free running testing, and it tends to be our drivers doing that. We've been involved actually at the moment in quite the exciting project over in South Wales, TFW, testing all their new stock, including their trams. So that's been quite an interesting project to be a part of. So from a sustainability perspective, where we fit, as mentioned, rail freight is more fuel efficient than road transport. We take lorries off the roads. A lot of us are very familiar with the figure of 76% less CO2 by tonne mile in regards to rail freight over road. But the thing that I feel Carl has touched on and Phil picked up as well, that really fits into this discussion of the circular economy is that our assets are long-term assets. A freight locomotive is built to last 40 or more years. Now, if I was kind of driving past an HGV that was built in the 1980s, I'd be a bit worried. So in terms of the circular economy and actually the sustainability of our assets, rail is doing very well, and we do not kind of promote that as much as perhaps we should. And this is why I think this discussion around circular economy is so beneficial for our industry. So that's kind of why we're good. I think it's pretty important that we talk about how we get better. I'm very glad that I've come after Carl. I didn't want to be in charge of explaining too much about the circular economy, but I did want to pick up on the three principles of circular economy. So moving away from the linear model of take, make and dispose, the three principles of the circular economy, it's about getting the highest value out of the projects we use, using them for as long as possible, maintenance over reuse, reuse over recycling, kind of the smallest loop and the least energy intensive loop is what we're kind of aiming for best practice within this framework. Excuse me. I'm at the start of a cold. I apologise if I get hoarser and hoarser. So in terms of the principles, designing out waste and pollution is critical. We're a procuring sustainably as a part of this, and focusing on the whole life cost rather than the base cost, which again kind of reflects quite well on the long-term assets used in rail freight. Keeping materials and products in use, I think this is where we perform best in terms of repair and maintenance. Subscription or rental for products over buying something often drives a better manufactured product as the manufacturer is incentivized to create a longer life project, and that's certainly a product which is kind of certainly can be seen in a lot of our assets which are leased rather than bought. And then regenerating natural systems, which is something we've perhaps not touched on quite so much, although certainly was noted in Victoria's discussion, particularly that anaerobic waste plant, which is a really exciting development. What we can be doing to kind of taking our waste to regenerate those natural systems in terms of creating the compost, in terms of creating biofuel that is truly sustainable. So where rail freight sits in all of that, we're obviously a service industry, we're not manufacturers. And I think the focus of the circular economy in certainly its startup and the way I've kind of seen it presented so frequently is a focus on manufacturing, and which is obviously necessary in terms of the greatest impact. But it's also about having this economic model for manufacturers that is about leasing rather than selling products, which I will kind of come back to again. We have these long-term assets, as I mentioned, kind of 40 plus years of a locomotive versus 5 to 7 years of an HGV. Parts replaced and repaired, which kind of keeps the whole asset going. But one that I really want to touch on that Phil kind of mentioned, and is the kind of picture at the back of this, is about redesign. Something that actually I think the industry has really embraced in recent years. First, the thing that really came kind of to the forefront in the time that I've been in rail freight is the redesign of coal wagons. So obviously, as we stopped moving coal to such an extent as an economy, we found that we had a huge amount of coal hopper wagons, which were no longer of use. Now, coal is a much less dense material than aggregates, so we could put aggregates into these wagons, but suddenly you're using an awful lot of length. Aggregate terminals tend to be stuck in centres of cities to be as close to where they're delivering products as possible. They're very, very space constrained. So these wagons were redesigned, and every kind of major freight operator has done this, a wagon manufacturer, effectively cutting the middle out of the wagon, squashing it together in what we've kind of colloquially called a cut and shut, to be able to kind of carry the denser weight of aggregate, so be able to carry the same weight but in a much kind of shorter wagon. And that's kind of been done, as I said, by all of us, and been a really successful way of repurposing otherwise useless assets to us. But the locomotive in the background here is the Class 69, which is something that GB Rail Freight and EMD have created. As I mentioned, GB Rail Freight has grown very rapidly. We were running out of locomotives. We needed more Class 66s, which are the backbone of the rail freight industry for most of the major operators. We were unable to, they're not allowed to be manufactured anymore. The most recent ones met the European emission standards of 3A, but that kind of reached a stage where that wasn't acceptable. What we did have was a bunch of Class 56s, which was a kind of early 1970s design locomotive, not powerful enough to pull what we needed to pull as a modern rail freight operator. So what we did was effectively take out the engine from a Class 56 and replace it with the Class 66, this 3A compliant diesel engine, and create the Class 69. So not necessarily driven by the theories behind the circular economy, but certainly kind of this redesign element, this kind of keep materials and products in use very much at the forefront of that. So what next? What next for us is the modular designs, and this is something that is very much central to a lot of circular economy thinking. I am contractually obliged every time I do any presentation to mention the Class 99. This is a modular design hybrid locomotive, which means that it can run off the wires, but as we know in the rail freight industry, those wires don't go all the places we go. So the Class 99 has a stage 5 compliant diesel engine in it, but it is modular. It is designed to be taken out and replaced with a battery in the future once battery technology reaches the stage that it will provide enough power to run this locomotive to pull the 2,500 tonnes of product behind it as we need. So all of this is kind of accidental. It's a great base. I say it's accidental because I don't see the principles of circular economy being at the forefront of what we've done as a rail freight industry, but certainly there are elements of the way we have these long-term assets that we redesign and reuse is very much central to it. So the next stage, I think, is looking at how we become a zero waste railway, and the icon there is from the Sustainable Rail Strategy run by the RSSB. I had a great conversation with Tom Rawson at the RSSB before this conversation around how they are kind of trying to bring the industry together in terms of thinking about zero waste on the railway, and particularly this kind of circular economy and circular operations that we can run. So this is about working with our suppliers, talking about a service model, leasing over ownership, which again, is something we do already. But I was having a conversation, for example, a couple of weeks ago, actually, about wheel sets and how we kind of think about wheel sets, who owns them, how they're refurbished, remanufactured, and so on. I think key for us is green energy, and again, this goes back to our regeneration of natural systems. It's vital we don't forget this element in discussing decarbonisation. We need to be making sure that our energy is coming from a green source that is sustainable. And we do need to be bringing the industry together here, and this is around the RSSB's work, bringing together manufacturers, infrastructure suppliers, operators, ROSCOs, because the zero waste railway really does have kind of the sound business case we need to continue to grow as an industry. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna, and thanks also, obviously, earlier we heard from Carl and Victoria. So don't forget that if anyone would like a copy of the slides, please get in touch with us, either directly or via Binary Carbon, and hopefully we can send them on. We've got about 5 minutes or so left for questions. And I think particular thanks to people who have been struggling this morning with various technology challenges. I put it down to the fact that we're all believers in the circular economy, and we're desperately trying to extend the asset life of our laptops that have got nothing against the value of locomotives. And I think, Susanna, you mentioned the so-called cut and shut, where you can make wagons smaller, but I believe cutting and shutting has also been done to make them longer, because there are some materials like biomass, for example, that are less dense than coal, and for the same reasons, you're trying to get the maximum amount of material in the shortest possible train. So we've got a couple of questions to start us off. So I think this one is for Victoria, and it's about waste. Waste by rail seems to be largely about domestic waste. What is the scope with commercial waste, and how can this be realised?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that we do move some commercial waste by rail from the Knowsley site, but ultimately it's about long-term contracts, and the commercial waste is quite transient. The reason we've been able to provide the facility at Knowsley and move waste by rail is because it's a 30-year contract where the investment is in the infrastructure. And obviously having the right site with the rail links is paramount to that. So I suppose it's about having the contracts in place that would support moving waste by rail from a commercial point of view. I think it definitely is something that can be done, but the infrastructure is limited at the moment in terms of moving waste. There's not that many facilities in the UK that do move waste by rail, but it's definitely something to look at. And as the waste reduces with the impact of the EPR, food waste reduction, etc., there will be more capacity at facilities that are moving waste by rail. So it does present an opportunity then to bring in waste on top of the contracted municipal waste and start to move that by rail as well. So there's plenty of opportunities coming up, and hopefully capacity in the system will grow.
Thank you for that. The next question, I think, is probably one for Carl, which is that profit is unlikely to change as the main driver in logistics. and rail freight. So how exactly do we get the Treasury to take a far clearer view of the externalities and the cost of carbon? The Green Book revisions don't seem to have produced much of a behaviour change or moved the dial very far.
I think that's a really good question. So I think there are lots of things. It's a multifaceted problem. And just as an example, one of the things that could be done within the industry is through the procurement process. For example, if there is a requirement which stipulates what circular economic value are you offering in relation to your competition, for example, then you would have to articulate what those things were. And for example, making things last longer, remanufacturing things, and those types of, but those types of incentives, I suppose, need to be embedded as part of the procurement, as part of the procurement process. And I think once those things are laid down, it would ultimately change behaviour, because we already know the horizon that's out there in terms of sustainability influences, legislation that's coming on stream. You've only got a window of opportunity to consider profit alone. That's it. And I think what you have to do is, in order to stay in business and to be viable in the future, you have to look at a more broader spectrum in terms of the identity of the organisation and what its value brings to wider society and and the sector as well. It can't just be on profit alone. It has to be multifaceted.
Okay, thanks. We are getting towards the end, but we've just got a couple more I'll read out, and then so one is how best can a rail leaser influence their upstream and downstream value chain to collect emissions whole life carbon data to better implement the circular economy principles? I think that's possibly one for Carl again.
Well, I talked about these platforms in my talk, and these are things which are saying, well, what needs to be in place is a number of platforms to basically answer that question. So, for instance, if you wanted to identify yourself as the differentiator between rail freight and road freight, if you were able to determine what you're essentially offsetting or what the differentials were, and the data was available, then you'd be able to express that. And so, things like, do you know what the potential is for offsetting road transport compared with what you're potentially offering as far as rail is concerned? Do you know what the blockers and enablers are to have different types of freight modes operating compared to the alternatives? And I just don't think the platforms are there in order for you to understand how these things can be leveraged. And I showed this systems model which looked at the different actors and stakeholders, and it's not difficult to do. It's just that those stakeholders and actors aren't doing the things that could make those big changes. And I think there is work that's already been undertaken by the RSSB and Network Rail. They just haven't been framed in this particular value way of doing things. But I think it will come on stream, definitely.
Thank you. I think we are probably pushed for time. There was a statement somebody put in the questions, basically pointing out that decarbonising rail freight is likely to be done through electrification, but these are in the future. There's a question there about using biodiesel or HVO. I know that is being used in the rail industry, but it's very much a transition fuel. And linked to electrification, we had a question in what is the panel's view from an environmental point of view of throwing away half an asset life of a diesel loco if it's going to be replaced by an electric one. I don't know whether anyone wants to have a quick one-word answer for that, because we are running over time now.
I can make a comment, yes. Joining those two things together a little. I would say, kind of to Ralph's question about the the traction decarbonisation, throwing away an asset, I would be extremely surprised if suddenly we all throw away our 66s in the next 10 years. There is clearly quite a lot of asset life left in them. What we do with them in the future, Network Rail have stated that they want no diesel-only traction on the network by 2040. So we need to think about actually what we do with the 66s, and like the 69s that we've created, I would expect that we would actually go down the road of remanufacturing them, repowering them, see what else we can do with the 66. Now, some of that may be using alternative fuels, as kind of the other question asked about biodiesel or HVO. There is clearly a cost to that. Having said that, there's a cost to electrification and the cost of electricity at the moment, which has meant that some of our competitors, GB Rail Freight, don't have many fully electric locomotives, but some of our competitors do, have actually parked them up because they're so expensive to run. So we need to consider actually the cost of alternative fuels, of electrification as well. It's definitely a way to go that we have to in terms of decarbonising our industry. But that also needs to kind of, it goes back to that kind of question about cost that I was talking about. So yeah, a lot of challenges there, but I think it's multifaceted, the answer of those two things.
Yeah, I think just building on that, Susanna, I mean, this is a great problem to solve, right? So, and that's what engineers do, that they're really good at solving these problems. And it's not just like buying a new one and not thinking about what to do with the old ones. If there's plenty of life left in things, then that's a great problem for engineers to solve. And this is where innovation comes in. That's the whole idea, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and, as I said, we're a growing business. We have about 166s and we're buying 30 99. It's quite to do the math to realise that the 99s are not going to be solely the replacement of the 66s. There will be something else.
Okay, I think we'll have to stop it there. So thanks again to our panel, Carl, Susanna and Victoria, and thanks to Binary Carbon for inviting us to take part in Decarbonising Transport Week. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you've enjoyed our webinar, you may be interested in other events organised by the Rail Freight Group. Full details of these can be found on our website, www.rfg.org.uk. And if you want to get in touch with us on the website, you can get a copy of the slides and the record. And as we said at the start, this is being recorded. So perhaps we may have the pleasure of your company at a future event. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.